actually producing things that the parents want their kids to have.
Yeah, but at the system level, the return to primary education may take so long for the private sector to realize that it may just not be provided.
You think that in general governments are better at seeing profit opportunities than private firms?
Well, it's not necessarily a profit maximization objective for primary schools.
That is, well, but that is in the case of the primary school, the main objective is the parents and the child's objective to maximize their profit, to have the child get an education that'll get him a good job and let him do various things.
With all the workers for your digital
I would expect that parents are a good deal more to be trusted to act in the interest of their children than our politicians, and are rather more likely, not less likely, to spot ways of doing so.
And the empirical record of Somaliland for primary schooling?
I don't know, but you'd want to compare it to Ethiopia because that's the adjacent status system. But as the example I was giving actually was England in the 19th century. And Scotland in the 18th and 19th century, you have some schools that are subsidized by the local governments, but I think more schools that are entirely private. And Scotland actually did quite well educationally by 18th century and early 19th century standards.
So your suggestion for primary schooling would be a voucher system that Parth would recommend, but simply
when you say
government has no view.
When you say my suggestion, you are discussing what would happen in a society without a government. And my point is that in that society, that's how it would happen. A voucher system is a considerable improvement over what we have. And one of the effects of a voucher system, I think, over time, would be that you would eventually have mostly private schools, some public schools that acted like private schools in order to keep their students. That at some point, some people might say, what's the point of paying taxes and getting it back? And you might then shift to saying, well, we'll subsidize some schooling for the poor, but ordinary people will become entirely private, which would be an improvement. But look, one of the general points I want to make, and that is there are certainly good things governments can do. The issue is whether on net governments do good or bad. So that you could, if you have a government making decisions, sometimes the government will make a better decision than the market. But as a general rule, since government decisions are being made by people who don't bear the cost of their decisions, and market decisions are being made by people who do usually bear the cost of their decisions, the market decisions on average are more likely to be in the general interest than the government decisions.
So coming from the financial crisis, I'll just segue from people who don't bear the cost of their financial decisions, and I came from Wall Street, where people did not, individually at least, or collectively bear the cost of their decisions.
Because the government chose to bail out the banks.
Yeah.
That's the way the government's supposed to work, right? Is it? That's a case where if there had been no government, if there had been no...
Your suggestion would be, let it go.
Yeah, let it go long earlier.
As
that is, presumably people were partly acting in the belief. Look, I mean, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were nominally private organizations, but people could be pretty sure that the government wouldn't let them go broke. And the fact that people knew that the government wouldn't let them go broke meant that it was worth taking risks that it wouldn't be worth taking risks in a private market. That's right. So you know, I'm certainly not an expert on the financial crisis. My professional interests are really in the economics of law, not in macroeconomics. Yeah, I've stayed out of that.
Sticking with that, so if we said that communism was discredited in 1989, and capitalism as we know it was discredited in 2008.
But it wasn't. The capitalist societies are still much richer than anybody else.
Sure is. It's the least imperfect system we know.
So what does discredited mean?
Well, we can ask the audience here what it means, but in many people's eyes, it didn't live up to a standard that they had expected of it. That's what I mean by discredited. So if after 89, the answer to the discredit of communism was not more communism, why would the answer to a discredit of capitalism not also be not more capitalism?
Because you are assuming,
even more virulent capitalism.
You're assuming that what went wrong was the capitalist part of what was, after all, a mixed economy. That the banking system is a heavily regulated industry, that the mortgage industry, at least in the US, not only was heavily regulated, the major players were created by the US Congress. I don't know about the rest of the world. I don't know about the situation in India. So it seems to me that the most you can say is that the particular mixture of capitalism and socialism that we had did worse at that point than it had been doing for the previous couple of decades. And that then raises the interesting question of why. And as I say, I'm not an expert on the financial crisis. And I'm trying to make much broader and more general arguments about why the institutions of voluntary exchange, on the whole and on average, produce better results than the institutions of political control.
What about defense?
That's one of the hard problems, yes. The third edition of Machinery of Freedom is not free. It's, I think, $2.95 or maybe $3.95 as a Kindle on Amazon, or you can get a printed copy, which is a little more expensive. And I discuss in that a number of the problems with my system. And there are really two major and one minor problem. One of the major problems is the risk of cartelization. That if there were only, suppose there are only 3 rights enforcement agencies. And so one day their presidents decide to have dinner together. And one of them says, you know, maybe government wasn't such a bad idea. In the old days before we had this system, the government was collecting $1 trillion a year in taxes. And all we get is a lousy $10 billion. Maybe we should reinvent government, all right? And that is a serious risk if there are 3 agencies. Pretty weak risk if there are 100 agencies or 200 agencies. It's hard to maintain cartels with large numbers. So one issue is what the equilibrium scale is going to be, and that might be different in different countries and times. The other hard problem is national defense, meaning defense against nations. And the reason that's a hard problem is that's what economists refer to as a pure public good. For those who aren't familiar with it, public good to economists does not mean a good the government produces. That many of the things governments produce are private goods, and many public goods are privately produced. So that, for example, a radio broadcast is a public good. Public good is a good where the producer can't control who gets it. If it's produced at all, it's available to all the members of a pre-existing group. And a second and less important feature where one person consuming it doesn't prevent somebody else from consuming it, like a radio broadcast. Nonetheless, some unknown genius figured out how to produce radio broadcasts privately by producing not one public good, but 2. One of them was a public good with a positive cost of production and a positive value to the consumer, called a radio program. And one was a public good with a negative cost of production and a negative value to the consumer, called an advertisement. Negative cost of production because people would pay the radio station to put it on. Tie them tightly together and give away the bundle. So that's one example of a way in which a public good can be produced privately. And the problem with national defense is you've got to find kludges, imperfect ways in which you can produce enough national defense to keep the system from collapsing. And I discussed some of those ideas in the first edition in a chapter which was entitled The Hard Problem. And in the third edition, I've got a bunch more fun ideas, and I think I called that The Hard Problem Part 2. So I think there are a number of ways in which you might be able to do it, but I don't know that you could do it. And I was less confident about my system when I wrote Machinery, because at that time the Soviet Union was a going concern and it looked like a serious threat to the US. At this point, there are no serious threats to the US, despite our vivid imagination. I did a calculation at the time of the first Iraq War. I added up the GNPs on the 2 sides of that war. The odds in the first Iraq War were roughly 100 to 1. That's not a war. All right? So Canada's not going to invade us. Mexico's not going to invade us. The Muslim extremists in the Middle East would be less interested in attacking us if we didn't have a government, because we wouldn't have a government doing things they didn't like. So I think the US at the moment, if you could persuade everybody to move to this kind of system, it wouldn't be much of a problem. But some societies at some times need a lot of resources for national defense, may or may not be able to raise it. I would point out, though, at least one fairly striking example, not of exactly my system, but of an anarchist system, and that's the Comanche Indians. The Comanche Indians were one of the Plains Indian tribes. They were anarchists. They had nothing you could recognize as a government, though they had various institutions. And they blocked expansion into their territory for about 150 years. They it's arguable that the reason the Midwest is American instead of Mexican is the Comanche. Because the Comanche were sitting there in the way of Mexican expansion, and instead of the Mexicans defeating them, they raided into Mexico, stole horses, enslaved people, made a general nuisance of themselves, and that blocked expansion. They blocked for several generations expansion across Texas. They eventually lost. But the Comanche, after all, had a tiny population compared to the US or Mexico. They had lower technology, and they were very good at fighting. And that particular society had institutions which rewarded people for successful warfare on a private basis. So I don't know, but I think it's going to depend a whole lot on both how serious the threats are and what kind of a culture that society has.
That's what the Israelites would have called David over Goliath, yeah? Anyway.
Yeah.
Let me segue into the next
Yes.
section, which is since you mentioned both cartelization and competitive dictatorship.
Yes.
What do you think of the four horsemen occupying digital space today? So, Facebook, Google, and the others. Is that, what is it? Competitive dictatorship? Just ordinary oligopoly?
Yeah, it's monopolistic competition is maybe the best term for it, because
which
the
is
characters
competitive, is roughly in the political space competitive dictatorship, is it not?
But yeah, but competitive, sure, except there are many fewer competitors.
So in your observation, if not your theory,
yeah,
this system of governance of the digital world would actually produce results, because you've got four reasonably...
Well, but they can't really govern it, because they're firms, they depend on You know, I remember when people thought that the great threat was IBM. You know, IBM was just going to run the world, and somehow it didn't happen because they made the wrong choices. And similarly for various other things
so one may fall off, like, you know, a province in China.
Well, Microsoft was supposed to run the world, and somehow it's not, doesn't seem to be doing very well either. So it seems to me that as long as you have a world with free entry, anytime that one of the major players starts doing a really bad job of providing what customers want, they're going to lose out to another one. There's an interesting book. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it's really specifically about monopoly in software. And the point that the authors make is that if you watch market share in software and reviews of programs, what you observe is that at a given time there's often a dominant program, Microsoft Word, say. But of course, before Microsoft Word, there was, well, I guess, for VisiCalc it was Lotus 1-2-3, and it was WordPerfect, I think, for that, and so forth. But then the normal pattern is you have a dominant program, and then the reviews start saying that some competitor is really better. And you've now got another dominant program. And then after a while, and so forth. So you get a series of replacements.
Yeah, so obsolescence takes place over time, but the idea that you would have 3 or 4 firms dominate in this competitive world.
In some markets. In some markets, you know, if you think about the market for generating information, how many web pages are out there? Anybody can start one. If you think about the market for books, we now have a much more competitive market for books, because not only can you publish a book as an e-book at no cost, you can publish a book as a print-on-demand book at very close to no cost. I've done it. So as the technology changes, there are going to be some areas where you have economies of scale that give you large firms and some small firms, and after a while some of the large firms will turn out not to work and be replaced by small, and some of the, I mean, the world is a changing place, but I don't see any particular threat in that.
So then let's go to the first point, which is about India and China. I'm not sure what exactly you meant by different capitalisms. You can observe that there are different capitalisms, but what is the normative conclusion of that for India, for instance?
The conclusion for India is that you shouldn't have a plan. That if you take the Chinese case, China started out with a plan, because Chen Yun, who along with Deng was the one survivor of the really top people after Mao died, and was really the economic czar insofar as there was one in the early period. And he believed in central planning. He would have done just fine in India. He, in fact, believed that Russia had succeeded. He, as I think many people in India did, that he believed the Russian claims and thought that Russia had created a modern society. Quite a lot of American economists believed it. It's fascinating. If you look at the textbooks, in particular Samuelson's textbook, you've got a period of 20 or 30 years in which each edition says that the USSR is catching up with the US. And each edition, the ratio of the GNPs is about the same. Right? It's either 20 or 30 years that was happening. So lots of people were fooled in that respect. But I think the argument that Coase would make is that not only did they do better by trial and error than they would have been by applying what they thought their theory was, that there was no theory that would have done better than trial and error. Because what set of institutions works depends on a lot of the detailed features of the society. That Coase refers to blackboard economics, which he doesn't think highly of. And, it's fine to say, let's have a free market, but how do you set it up so that the courts actually enforce contracts? How do you set it up so that if there are government officials, they don't steal from people? A whole lot of complicated things, and Coase's argument is that of the various imperfect ways, trial and error is the best, and the results will be different in different countries. So that, for example, part of how the Chinese system works is that you have industrial parks which are run by local governments, and the local government is providing both the normal services of a landlord and an interface with the political system. So you have a single office, which is theoretically two offices, but it's one place and one set of people. And it both tells the firms that are in the industrial park, we'll arrange for your electricity, we arrange for your internet, we take care of all of these things. But then the guy over at the other desk will arrange for your permits and take care of your questions about taxation and interface with the government. So that was one mechanism. It works pretty well because it's a competitive system in which if one local government does a bad job of offering services, it'll lose out to the next local government over. It's not the way things developed in the US. It might be better or worse, but it seems to work. And I gave the example of the two models of a department store, where there's no theoretical reason to say one is better than the other, and yet apparently one is better in that culture and that set of constraints than the others.